They went to the town archives and found out that the old man's name was Harold Johnson. He had lived in the house on Elm Street with his wife and son. One day, his wife and son had disappeared, and no one knew what had happened to them. Harold had become obsessed with finding his family, and he had spent all his time searching for them. He had become deranged and paranoid, convinced that someone had taken them from him. He had barricaded himself in the house, refusing to leave until he found his family. The friends were horrified by the story, but it helped to explain why the old man had become so crazed. They decided to try and find out what had happened to his wife and son, hoping that it would give them closure and help them move on from the experience. They searched through old newspapers and public records and eventually found out what had happened. Harold's wife and son had died in a car accident, and their bodies had been buried in a nearby cemetery. Harold had never known the truth, and it had driven him to madness. The friends decided to visit the graves of Harold's family and pay their respects. As they stood there, they felt a sense of closure, like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. They knew that they would never forget the experience, but they also knew that they could finally move on from it. As they left the cemetery and drove away, they saw the old house on Elm Street in their rearview mirror. It still stood there, dark and ominous, but they didn't feel afraid anymore. They knew that the old man was gone, and they had faced their fears and come out stronger on the other side. The house on Elm Street would always be a part of their past, but it would no longer haunt their present. It was a cool autumn evening when Alex, Sarah, Jack, and Emily decided to explore the abandoned house on Elm Street. The four friends were all in their early 20s and had grown up in the small town where the house was located. They had all heard the rumors about the haunted house, but none of them had ever been brave enough to explore it until now. As they approached the house, they could feel their hearts beating faster. The old, decrepit house had been vacant for years, and its dark and ominous appearance was enough to scare anyone away. But the thrill of adventure and the promise of a good scare drew the friends closer to the house. The house had a large front yard that was overgrown with weeds and tall grass. The windows were boarded up, and the door was locked. The only way in was through a broken window on the side of the house. The friends cautiously climbed through the window and found themselves in the dusty living room. The room was in complete disarray, with furniture overturned and debris strewn about. As they made their way through the house, they noticed that every room was in a similar state of neglect. It was as if the previous occupants had left in a hurry and never returned. The friends continued to explore the house, fascinated by the eerie atmosphere. They made their way to the kitchen, where they found old pots and pans still sitting on the stove. In the dining room, they found a long table with chairs still pushed in, as if waiting for the next meal. As they climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, they could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. As they reached the upstairs bedrooms, they heard a faint whisper coming from one of the rooms. They followed the sound and found a room with a locked door. They tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and they heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. They froze, unsure of what to do. The footsteps grew louder, and they could hear heavy breathing. Suddenly, the door to the locked room burst open, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was an old man, with wild hair and a crazed expression on his face. The friends tried to run, but the man was too quick. He chased them through the house, taunting them with a twisted grin on his face. They realized too late that the man was the deranged owner of the house who had never left. The man was quick and nimble, despite his age. He seemed to know every inch of the house, and was able to cut off the friends' escape routes. His eyes were wild, and his laugh was maniacal. The friends were terrified, not knowing how to escape the clutches of this madman. As they scrambled to find a way out of the house, the man blocked their path at every turn. They were trapped, with no escape in sight. The man's laughter echoed through the halls, sending shivers down their spines. They finally managed to find a window that was not boarded up, and they climbed out one by one. But as they turned to make their escape, they saw the man standing at the window, watching them with a sinister smile. They knew they had not seen the last of him. One night, Sarah woke up in a cold sweat. She had a dream about the old man in the house. She tried to shake it off, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave her. She decided to call the others and see if they were feeling the same way. When she called Jack, he told her that he had been having nightmares about the house too. He had dreamt that the old man had followed him home and was standing outside his window watching him. Emily had been feeling the same way, and Alex had heard strange noises in his house that he couldn't explain. They decided to meet up and talk about what was going on. They all agreed that the old man in the house on Elm Street had left a mark on them, and they couldn't seem to shake it. They decided to investigate the history of the house and the old man. The moment they laid their eyes on the abandoned house on Willow Lane, John and Samantha knew that it was the perfect place to start their new life together. The old, creaky Victorian-style house had character and charm, and it was far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As they walked through the overgrown garden and up the front steps, they noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. "I guess we don't need to worry about getting the locks changed," John joked nervously as they stepped inside. The inside of the house was even more stunning than the outside. The hardwood floors shone in the sunlight streaming in from the windows, and the walls were adorned with beautiful wallpaper that looked like it had been there for decades. But as they explored the house further, they noticed that something was off. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, and there were no signs of life anywhere in the house. It was as if the previous owner had just vanished into thin air. As they were exploring the kitchen, Samantha noticed a piece of paper stuck to the underside of one of the cabinets. She pulled it off and saw that it was a map of the house with a series of X's and arrows pointing in different directions. "What do you think this is?" she asked John. "I have no idea," he replied, looking over her shoulder, "but I have a feeling we're going to find out." As they continued to explore the house, John and Samantha discovered more and more clues that the previous owner had left behind. A torn piece of paper with a phone number scribbled on it, a key hidden in the floorboards of the living room, and a strange message etched into the fireplace. The more they investigated, the more they realized that there was something sinister about the previous owner's disappearance, but they couldn't put their finger on what it was. That was until they discovered a secret room hidden behind a bookshelf in the study. Inside the room, they found a desk covered in papers, a computer, and a safe. The safe was locked tight, but there was a note taped to the front of it that read, "You'll need this." John used the key they had found earlier to unlock the safe, and inside they found a folder filled with documents. As they read through the documents, they realized that the previous owner had been investigating a series of disappearances that had occurred in the area over the past few years. One of the documents contained a name and an address: Stephen Johnson, 112 Willow Lane. John and Samantha were shocked to discover that the previous owner of their new home had been investigating their very own address. They couldn't believe it, but they knew they had to investigate further. They drove to the address listed on the document and found an old, run-down house with a broken fence and overgrown lawn. As they approached the front door, they could hear strange noises coming from inside. They pushed open the door and stepped inside, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The inside of the house was covered in blood, and there were strange symbols etched into the walls. It was clear that something terrible had happened there. As they were investigating, they heard a noise coming from upstairs. They slowly made their way up the stairs, and when they reached the top, they found a room that was filled with strange objects and symbols. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. They turned around to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with a menacing look in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "We're just looking for answers," Samantha replied, trying to stay calm. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, pulling out a knife. "You're not supposed to know about this." John and Samantha knew they were in trouble. They backed away slowly as the man approached them with the knife. But just as they thought all hope was lost, they heard a loud bang. The man fell to the ground, and they turned around to see a police officer standing in the doorway. "Are you okay?" the officer asked, his gun still smoking. John and Samantha nodded, and the officer helped them out of the house. As they sat in the back of the ambulance, they tried to make sense of everything that had happened. It turned out that the man they had encountered was Stephen Johnson, the previous owner of their house. He had been investigating a cult that had been responsible for the disappearances in the area, and they had found out about his investigation. The cult had killed him and staged his disappearance as a way to cover up their tracks. They had also been watching the couple ever since they moved into the house. As John and Samantha settled into their new home, they couldn't help but think about the horror they had experienced at 100 and 12 Willow Lane. They had never imagined that their dream of owning a house in the countryside would turn into a nightmare. They had nightmares for weeks after the incident, reliving the moment they came face to face with Stephen Johnson and the cult. But they knew that they had to move on and start fresh. They kept in touch with the police officer who had saved their lives, and he updated them on the investigation into the cult. They were eventually able to bring them to justice, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. John and Samantha decided to start a new chapter in their lives. They moved to a new town and started a family. They never forgot about their experience at 112 Willow Lane, but they were determined to move forward and not let it define their lives. Years later, when their children were old enough, they told them the story of the house on Willow Lane. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder that there are dark forces in the world that we must be careful of. But most importantly, it was a story of survival, of how John and Samantha had faced their fears and come out the other side. And that, they knew, was a story worth telling. As the sun began to set on a warm summer evening, a group of teenagers gathered outside the abandoned house on Maple Street. The house had been empty for years, and rumors swirled about its dark past. Some said that a family had been murdered inside, while others claimed that the house was haunted by vengeful spirits. Despite the warnings, the group was determined to investigate the truth for themselves. The house itself was an imposing structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. The front door hung off its hinges, creaking eerily in the breeze, but it was the basement that interested the teenagers the most. According to the rumors, something terrible had happened down there, and the basement was now sealed off to the public. One of the teenagers, a boy named Alex, had managed to find a way inside. He led the others through the darkened interior, using a flashlight to guide their way. They crept down the creaking stairs to the basement, their hearts pounding with excitement and fear. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a dimly lit room filled with cobwebs and dust. The air was stale and musty, and the only sound was the soft drip of water from a leaky pipe. The teenagers fanned out, searching for any clues to the basement's dark past. That's when they heard the first sound. It was a soft shuffling noise, like something moving in the shadows. The teenagers froze, their flashlights trained on the darkness, and then they saw it. There, in the corner of the room, was a shapeless mass of darkness. It seemed to be pulsing and writhing, as if alive. The teenagers backed away in terror, but the thing didn't move. It just stayed there, watching them with unseen eyes. They tried to run, but the door at the top of the stairs wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. Trapped in the basement with the pulsing darkness, the teenagers huddled together, their hearts pounding with fear. That's when the thing attacked. It moved impossibly fast, slamming into the teenagers with a force that sent them flying. They screamed and thrashed, but the thing was too strong. It wrapped itself around them, suffocating them with its darkness. As the last of the teenagers fell silent, the thing retreated into the shadows, its hunger sated for now. But it would always be there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting victims to disturb its slumber in the basement on Maple Street. Days passed, and the teenagers never returned home. Their parents reported them missing, and the police launched a search party. They combed the area around the abandoned house on Maple Street, but there was no sign of the teenagers. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The locals whispered about the basement, warning others not to go near it. But as time went on, the rumors faded, and the house on Maple Street became just another forgotten relic of the past. Years later, a new family moved into the house. They had no idea about the dark history of the basement, and they set about renovating the old house with excitement and enthusiasm. But as they tore down walls and ripped up old carpets, they noticed strange things happening. Objects would move on their own, and they heard whispers in the darkness. The mother of the family, a woman named Maria, became convinced that something was living in the basement. She begged her husband to investigate, but he dismissed her fears as unfounded. That was until one night when he heard the soft shuffling noise coming from the basement. He went down to investigate, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. He crept down the creaking stairs, his heart pounding with fear. At the bottom, he found himself in the same dimly lit room that the teenagers had explored years before, and there, in the corner, was the same shapeless mass of darkness. The man froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The darkness seemed to be pulsing and writhing, as if alive. He tried to run, but the door at the top of the stairs was stuck. As the darkness enveloped him, he felt a sense of dread unlike anything he had ever felt before. He screamed and thrashed, but it was no use. The darkness suffocated him, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell. When Maria found her husband's lifeless body the next morning, she knew that the rumors were true. Something evil was living in the basement on Maple Street, and it was not content to remain hidden forever. Over the years, more people came to the house, each one ignorant of the darkness that lurked below, and each one met the same terrible fate, swallowed up by the pulsing darkness in the basement. The house on Maple Street became known as a cursed place, a warning to those who dared to disturb the dead. But still, some were drawn to its dark allure, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. Chestnut Avenue was known for its beautiful old houses, but there was one house that stood out, abandoned for years and rumored to be haunted. No one had been brave enough to enter the house, except for one man, John, a paranormal investigator. John had been investigating hauntings for years, but he had never encountered anything like the house on Chestnut Avenue. As he walked up to the house, he could feel the chill in the air. The house looked abandoned, but he knew that there was something inside. John set up his equipment and began his investigation. At first, everything was quiet, but as the night went on, he began to hear strange noises. Footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the wind, and doors creaking open on their own. As John continued his investigation, he discovered that the house was haunted by the spirits of a family who had died in a tragic accident years before. He could sense their presence, and it was clear that they were trying to communicate with him. John decided to focus on communicating with the spirits. He set up a Ouija board and began to ask questions. The spirits responded, but their answers were cryptic and confusing. Suddenly, John heard a loud noise coming from upstairs. He grabbed his flashlight and headed up the stairs, heart racing. As John reached the top of the stairs, he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was blurry and indistinct, but he could tell that it was human-shaped. He approached cautiously, calling out to the figure. As he got closer, he realized that it was a woman. She was young, with long brown hair and a dress that looked like it was from the early 1900s. She was staring at him with a look of sadness and fear in her eyes. John asked the woman if she was one of the spirits that he had been communicating with. The woman nodded her head slowly. John tried to ask her more questions, but she vanished before he could get any answers. John was shaken, but determined to continue his investigation. He went back downstairs and resumed his work, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The night wore on, and John was getting tired. He decided to take a break and sit in the living room. As he sat down on the couch, he heard a soft voice whisper his name. He looked around but saw no one. The voice continued, getting louder and more urgent. Suddenly, John felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He jumped up, heart pounding. When he turned around, he saw a man standing behind him. The man was middle-aged, with a stern expression and a mustache. He was wearing a suit and tie, but his clothes were old-fashioned. The man introduced himself as William, and John quickly realized that he was another one of the spirits in the house. William told John that he had been the father of the family that had lived in the house years ago. William explained that his family had been happy and successful until one day his wife had fallen ill. They had spent all their money on medical bills and were struggling to make ends meet. William had taken on a risky business deal to try to save their finances, but it had backfired, leading to a financial disaster for the family. The stress and pressure had taken a toll on his wife, who had ultimately taken her own life. William and his 2 children had been devastated by the loss, and they had all died in the years that followed. John felt a deep sense of sadness for William and his family. He realized that the spirits in the house were not trying to scare him, but they were trying to communicate their story. As John left the house, he knew that he had to share the story of the family that had once lived there. He wanted to honor their memory and help others understand the tragedy that had taken place. The ghosts of 56 Chestnut Avenue would never be forgotten. After leaving the house on Chestnut Avenue, John couldn't stop thinking about the spirits he had encountered. He spent days researching the history of the house and the family who had lived there. He discovered that William and his wife had been prominent members of the community and that their deaths had been a shock to everyone. John also learned that the house had been empty for years, and no one had ever come forward to claim it. He wondered if the tragic history of the family had scared away potential buyers. As John delved deeper into his research, he began to feel a sense of responsibility towards the spirits. He wanted to help them find peace and closure. He decided to organize a public event, inviting the community to come and learn about the history of the house and the family who had lived there. He hoped that by sharing the story, he could help the spirits move on and find the peace they had been seeking. The event was a success, with a large turnout of people eager to learn about the history of the house. John shared the story of the family, and many people were moved to tears by the tragedy of their lives. As the event came to an end, John felt a sense of peace. He realized that he had accomplished what he had set out to do. He had honored the memory of the family and helped others understand their story. As he left Chestnut Avenue, John couldn't help but feel that the spirits of the family were watching over him. He knew that they had found the closure they had been seeking and that they were finally at peace. The house on Chestnut Avenue remained abandoned, but it was no longer forgotten. The tragic story of the family who had once lived there had been brought to light, and their memory would live on forever. And John, the paranormal investigator, had played a small but important role in their journey toward peace. It was a cool autumn evening when a group of urban explorers set their sights on 21 Oak Street. The abandoned house had long been rumored to be haunted, and they were eager to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they approached the house with caution. As they made their way through the overgrown yard, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The house was old and dilapidated, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof, but they were determined to see what was inside. With a creaky front door as their only obstacle, they pushed their way into the dark interior. The smell of musty old wood filled their nostrils as they made their way through the first floor. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from every corner. They climbed the rickety stairs to the second floor, their flashlights barely illuminating the way. It was then that they heard it, a low guttural growling that seemed to come from deep within the house. They froze, unsure of what to do next. Was it an animal, or something more sinister? As if in answer to their question, a door at the end of the hallway suddenly slammed shut. They jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. But there was no turning back now. They had to see this through to the end. They cautiously made their way to the door, their hands shaking with fear. They slowly pushed it open, expecting to find something terrifying on the other side. Instead, they found nothing. The room was empty, save for a single piece of paper on the floor. It was yellowed and stained, with faded writing in the center. As they leaned in to read it, they could feel a strange energy emanating from the page. It was then that they realized they had made a grave mistake. They had unknowingly unleashed a curse that had been dormant for decades, and they were about to become its next target. The group of urban explorers quickly realized that they had stumbled upon something beyond their understanding. The writing on the paper they found indicated that the curse was specific, and it was targeted at a particular person. As they tried to leave the house, they found that the doors and windows wouldn't open, and they were trapped inside. The group tried to remain calm and come up with a plan to escape. However, their nerves were frayed, and they soon began to turn on each other. They started arguing and blaming each other for their predicament. As the night wore on, the group began to hear strange noises coming from different parts of the house. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. They were all on edge and struggling to keep their fear in check. One of the members of the group even began to experience unexplained injuries, with bruises appearing on their body without any reason. This only added to the fear and paranoia that was already present. As they searched for a way out, the group found themselves trapped in a room. The only exit was a small window, but it was too small for them to escape. It was then that they realized the true nature of the curse. It wasn't just a random curse, but a curse that targeted people who had done wrong. It was a curse of revenge. As the night wore on, the group began to see visions of the person the curse was targeting. They could see the terrible things this person had done, and the curse had been waiting for the right time to strike. As the sun began to rise, the group was finally able to escape the house. They were shaken and traumatized, but they were alive. But the curse wasn't done yet. It had only just begun to exact its revenge, and the group knew that they would never be able to escape it. The curse was real, and it would continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had unknowingly stumbled upon something that should have remained buried, and they would now pay the price for their curiosity. The group went their separate ways, each of them trying to forget the horrors they had experienced. But the curse continued to follow them, plaguing them with strange occurrences and unexplained events. One member of the group began to experience vivid nightmares, reliving the events of that night over and over again. Another member started to see strange symbols etched into the walls of their home, symbols that they recognized from the abandoned house on Oak Street. As time went on, the curse became more and more powerful, and the members of the group began to fear for their lives. They knew that they had brought this curse upon themselves, and they had no idea how to stop it. They tried everything they could think of to break the curse. They went to psychics, priests, and anyone who claimed to have knowledge of the supernatural. But nothing worked.